au Africa Week de groupe S&D dans le Parlement européen. On a une très intéressante discussion de vous présenter, mais avant ça, j'aimerais vous prendre avec moi sur une visite virtuelle à Togo. On va lancer la vidéo tout de suite.
On a imaginé cette expérience que nous menons à Lomé depuis 2012, qui est de créer des lieux d'innovation entièrement ouverts où les gens du quartier viennent et développent eux-mêmes les technologies qui rendent leur quartier smart. Au jour d'aujourd'hui, on a deux espaces, donc Wellab 0 et Wellab Prime, qui sont deux espaces d'à peu près 650 mètres carrés chacun, ce qui fait à deux lieux aujourd'hui de nous le plus gros tech hub de la sous-région. Donc c'est toute une culture, une nouvelle culture du digital mais collaboratif que nous essayons de créer ici pour répondre un peu au capitalisme digital qui lui vient de la Silicon Valley ou de la Chine. Dans le choix des projets qu'on développe, on essaie de passer en revue toutes les thématiques urbaines. Scope pour la collecte des déchets, Sysway pour le système d'échange, Urbanatic pour la production de potagers bio, toujours dans le territoire Hub Cité. Webbots pour la fabrication d'imprimantes 3D en matériaux recyclés qu'on met dans les écoles. Donc cette couche, c'est une couche vraiment projet, développée collectivement et dont l'ambition est de faire des startups. Si je prends l'exemple du projet Scope, nous on s'occupe de collecter et de trier dans ce lieu tous les déchets plastiques de tous les foyers dans le quartier qui voudraient souscrire à cette solution. Nous venons pratiquement dans la journée lever vos déchets plastiques et on vous donne un autre kit à remplir. Et pour chaque kit que vous remplissez, vous générez des points qui ont valeur de monnaie virtuelle, qui peut être aussi utilisée dans le quartier. Nous-mêmes, on fait souvent ce qu'on appelle des pop-up ici, où donc les gens du quartier qui ont du crédit Sysway sur leur téléphone, soit parce qu'ils collectent leurs déchets, soit parce qu'ils font de l'agriculture urbaine ou qu'ils utilisent quelque autre projet de l'écosystème Hub Cité, puissent venir faire des achats. Urbanatic est le projet qui veut adresser la question de la ressource alimentaire en ville.
Il y a une méconnaissance de comment cultiver, comment avoir des produits finis. Face à ce problème de croissance, nous avons eu l'idée de créer Urbanatic, qui est une plateforme web, un serveur de réseau de greniers en ville pour une production et pour un développement du réflexe de consommation des produits bio.
Les tout premiers potagers que nous avons créés, on a beaucoup fait dans la transformation d'anciens dépotoirs. Et l'objectif de ce projet, c'est de prendre le pari qu'en étant un peu subtil, on peut transformer des quartiers en leur propre grenier. On ne peut pas juste vouloir être innovant et commencer à préparer des projets futuristes. Il faut surtout faire des gens qui eux-mêmes sont innovants et qui demain, quel que soit le problème qui se pose, sont en capacité de développer des projets.
Grâce à la je connais l'ordinateur, l'informatique, beaucoup de choses.
On a aidé beaucoup de jeunes à se lancer depuis ce lieu-ci. On a fait venir beaucoup de projets, beaucoup de mentors, etc.
Moi, je trouve ça que c'est bon pour aider les élèves, que demain aussi, ils deviennent quelque chose dans la vie quotidienne.
Si cela peut continuer et semer et qu'on se retrouve dans 5 ans à plusieurs centaines de Wellab dans les villes du Togo, ce sera un très bel achèvement aussi, mais cela dépendra de la capacité que nous aurons à capter des ressources parce qu'avec nos ressources propres, évidemment, on ne sera pas soutenable à mesure qu'on va faire des itérations. L'ambition, c'est que tout soit tellement enchevêtré qu'on atteigne réellement une Smart City.
J'ai le plaisir d'avoir le chef du projet Hub City, Sename Kofi, avec moi ici en studio. Bonjour Sename.
Bonjour.
Merci d'avoir venu.
Merci pour l'invitation.
Oui, vous êtes architecte, vous êtes anthropologue, vous êtes le visionnaire de Hub City. Comment est-ce que ça a tout commencé? Ça fait déjà quelques années, n'est-ce pas, que vous avez commencé ce projet?
Oui, ça fait une petite dizaine d'années, en fait nos 10 ans cette année-ci, qu'on réfléchit à une alternative, à quelque chose qu'on a donc vu apparaître il y a 10 ans, qui est le concept de Smart City. C'est-à-dire que il y a 10 ans, nos gouvernements, les gouvernements africains ont beaucoup commencé à vendre la Smart City et très vite j'ai essayé d'alerter sur un certain nombre de problèmes que pouvait créer la Smart City, mais en tentant de prouver que ce n'était pas de la technophobie, ce n'était pas la technologie dans la Smart City qui était problématique, mais la façon dont les grands groupes américains notamment essayaient d'instrumentaliser les technologies pour en faire une grande base de marché, notamment en vendant des villes entièrement équipées. Mais qu'on pouvait faire donc de la Smart City un peu bricolée à la base, en offrant au quartier des lieux ressources où les gens pouvaient, parce que les technologies sont suffisamment démocratisées aujourd'hui, s'en emparer pour développer à leur échelle et dans la proximité des petites technologies qui font des smart quartiers et donc compenser un peu les politiques visiblement essentiellement top-down par aussi du bottom-up en termes de production technologique de la ville.
Oui, et on a vu dans la vidéo que c'est ça que vous voulez. Vous voulez que les gens s'enseignent eux-mêmes et eux-mêmes décident de quoi il faut construire. C'était, je crois, ils ont dit une start-up pour faire des start-up, alors pour enseigner aux gens comment faire eux-mêmes leur start-up.
C'est ça.
Qu'est-ce que vous avez vu comme vous avez parlé un peu dans la vidéo du waste collection, du six-way, urbanatic, de la monnaie virtuelle. C'est quoi pour vous une grande victoire, un grand exemple du fait que ça marche, le bottom-up dans ce...
Alors, notre succès est à la fois très mitigé et assez évident, puisqu'on a énormément de presse, on a énormément de jeunes personnes, de jeunes figures qui ont émergé grâce à cette expérimentation qu'on mène. Mais mitigé en termes de succès parce que c'est entièrement autofinancé. Ça fait 10 ans que que j'ai ce petit engagement avec mes propres ressources. Et évidemment, on n'a pas pu itérer et coloniser la ville de Lomé comme on l'ambitionnait au début, mais on a quand même 2 lieux qu'on a réussi à ouvrir, qui essaient d'intervenir dans leur proximité, et c'est dans des quartiers, par exemple, où il y a plus autant de déchets plastiques dans la rue, parce que depuis ces espaces, on collecte tous les déchets plastiques, où des gens commencent à utiliser des systèmes d'échange qui les émancipent un peu du fiduciaire tel qu'on le connaît, etc. etc. Mais c'est surtout, au-delà des start-up, des solutions que nous développons, de plus en plus de gens qui sont initiés aux nouvelles technologies et qui deviennent des smart citizens. Et c'est ça notre pari, c'est que au lieu de vouloir essayer d'être prêt et de développer toutes les solutions qui feront qu'on mettra à distance les problèmes qui vont se poser à la ville demain, il vaudrait mieux parier sur de l'éducation et de la formation, parce qu'on ne peut pas anticiper les problèmes. Donc il faut faire des gens qui seraient capables, quels qu'ils se présentent demain, ces problèmes-là, de pouvoir les adresser.
C'est vraiment inspirant et je vous souhaite, comme vous avez dit aux vidéos, que vous auriez des centaines de WeLab dans tout Togo.
Merci.
Parlons-en un peu pour la raison pour laquelle vous êtes ici aujourd'hui. Vous êtes ici pour Africa Week. Demain, vous êtes le modérateur pour un panneau sur le déficit de l'infrastructure, dont j'aimerais parler aussi. Mais surtout, vous avez aussi une exposition qui ouvre demain au Fab Lab de l'ULB qui s'appelle Communalis. Dites-nous un peu pour ceci.
Donc oui, j'ai eu une double invitation très gentille de Africa Week pour une réflexion globale autour de l'avenir des infrastructures en Afrique. Donc sous forme de débat demain, où j'aurai le grand plaisir de modérer un panel, mais aussi pour faire une sorte d'œuvre d'art, une installation qu'on pourra voir à partir de demain, j'espère, parce qu'on est toujours en train de visser de toute assemblée, donc à CU. Et c'est donc une sorte de travail un peu conceptuel avec beaucoup de machines de prototypage rapide, CNC, impression 3D, pour montrer et donner un peu de la chair, même si c'est conceptuel, à cette idée qu'on puisse produire de l'infrastructure bottom-up, c'est-à-dire qu'on peut créer dans la ville le dispositif qui permettrait que les gens développent eux-mêmes leur énergie de proximité, commencent eux-mêmes à transformer le cadre de vie, etc. et acquièrent de plus en plus de pouvoir sur la transformation de la ville grâce à des espaces qu'on leur offrirait. Alors tout ça prend une forme, encore une fois, très conceptuelle dans le cadre de cette œuvre que vous pourrez découvrir à partir de demain et pour laquelle on réfléchit à mettre en place une forme d'entrée virtuelle pour que même depuis chez vous, vous puissiez la visiter.
Vous pouvez visiter notre site socialistsanddemocrats.eu demain et utiliser un QR code qui vous donnera accès à Comunale, cette exposition. Avant de partir, Sename, dites-nous un peu pour demain, qu'est-ce que vous voudrez voir sur le panneau que vous allez modérer? Quel est le problème? Quel est le déficit infrastructurel?
Disons que la question, au-delà de l'infrastructure, la question de l'urbanité, en termes de concept se pose désormais à deux niveaux, mais les gens ont l'air de rater cela. Il y a un niveau un peu carrément de vue de satellite qui nous a imposé, puisque les villes qui vont se proposer en Afrique demain sont carrément des villes-régions, c'est des villes à cheval sur plusieurs pays, et on ne peut pas continuer à les penser à l'intérieur des pays tels qu'ils existent aujourd'hui. Donc il faudrait développer une sorte de vision panafricaine, un peu pragmatique, donc il y a une échelle très générale, qui peut être même une sorte d'opportunité parce que ça nous permettrait, si on rentre dans cette vision-là, de réfléchir à des choses qui sont beaucoup moins coûteux pour l'environnement. On pourrait imaginer de la circularité, de la mobilité fluviale, ce qui est impossible à voir aujourd'hui si on reste encore une fois dans le cadre des pays. On pourrait imaginer des grands systèmes de déplacement à l'échelle du continent. Et donc une autre échelle, qui est l'échelle vraiment de la proximité, qui, elle, nous est proposée par la révolution du digital. C'est-à-dire que le digital nous offre aujourd'hui les moyens de penser des quartiers entièrement autonomes, désintriqués de cette sorte de grande ville mondiale que le système capitaliste dans lequel le système capitaliste essaie de nous verrouiller. Et donc j'espère que demain on pourra aborder un peu dans cet échange ces deux échelles-là, l'échelle panafricaine et voir aussi comment dans la proximité on pourrait mettre en capacité des gens, des institutions, des dispositifs de transformer et de produire de l'infrastructure à l'échelle.
Merci beaucoup. Ce qui est intéressant avec Africa Week, c'est qu'on a nos partenaires européens et africains qui parlent. Et le thème de ces jours-ci, c'est qu'on passe de la discussion aux actions. Qu'est-ce que vous aimeriez voir comme des actions potentielles dans le futur entre nos deux continents? Alors,
ce n'est pas de l'action, c'est même le contraire de l'action. Voilà, alors, ce que je proposerais, c'est un changement de paradigme. Donc, ce n'est pas de l'action, mais c'est la base qui vous permet de pouvoir enchaîner sur de l'action normalement. Dans le sens où je pense que le paradigme actuel est un biais un peu comment dire, disons qu'il n'y a pas assez d'honnêteté en réalité. Alors, je vais être un peu polémique, mais je pense que Africa Week,
on est là pour discuter de tout ça, oui.
Je pense qu'en réalité, pour vraiment utiliser des termes très crus, pendant longtemps, l'Europe a considéré qu'il fallait maintenir l'Afrique dans une forme de végétation, de végétabilité, ou je ne sais pas quel terme utiliser, et que le retard relatif qu'on observe aujourd'hui, soit on le fabriquait, presque inconsciemment, ou en tout cas on s'en accommodait parce qu'on se disait que c'était peut-être la meilleure façon de pouvoir continuer à profiter de ce continent. Ce que j'essaie de dire, c'est qu'on ne peut plus avoir cette vision instrumentale de ce continent, cette vision comme uniquement une sorte de réserve de ressources qu'il faut surtout ne pas trop développer pour qu'elle puisse profiter au nord, à cause de la démographie et de tout ce que cette pression démographique et urbaine va générer comme bouleversement parfois très consistant sur ce continent même. Et donc il faudrait que l'Europe comprenne que ce n'est pas soutenable, cette sorte de relation où on n'autorise pas l'Afrique en réalité à parler sourcil contre sourcil à l'Europe et qu'il faudrait maintenant désinhiber ce continent, faire sauter les verrous à la créativité qu'on a mis un peu de façon subtile pour que l'Afrique se réalise. Et c'est le pari demain d'avoir une sorte de relation complètement apaisée avec ce continent.
Merci beaucoup, c'est très inspirant et j'espère vraiment que l'exposition et le débat demain feront penser à tout ça. Merci beaucoup, Sénat.
Merci encore à vous pour l'invitation.
Évidemment. Vous pouvez, une fois de plus, voir demain l'exposition sur notre site socialistanddemocrats.eu. Vous pouvez nous voir sur les médias sociaux avec le hashtag #WithAfrica. Et demain, le panneau sera à 12h30. Avant cela, on va rester ici pour 14h. Il y a un panneau sur Climate Emergency entre EU et Africa, Promoting Green Innovation for People and Nature. Merci et à tout à l'heure.
everyone, and welcome to the second session of the first day of Africa Week 2022, promoted by the European Socialists and Democrats. We're live from the European Parliament in Brussels, Belgium. My name is Amara Wampa, and I will be your moderator. This morning, we had an engaging conversation, I must say, about bridging Africa's leadership generational gap. Just before this current session, we also witnessed the opening of a digital exhibition on infrastructure in Africa. If you have been paying attention, one keyword that keeps popping up is sustainability. In this session, we will discuss climate challenges facing Africa and explore innovative mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and energy access solutions that could potentially inform a solid, future-proof, and mutually beneficial green pact between the EU and Africa. This conversation will be led by a panel of very knowledgeable speakers who I will introduce shortly. If you're joining us online, please feel free to contribute to this conversation using the appropriate feature on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. When it comes to climate change, Africa is literally in the eye of the storm. Despite its minimal historical and current emissions of greenhouse gases, Africa will suffer some of the worst severe consequences of climate change if adequate steps are not taken. Africa's unique exposure to extreme droughts, flooding, storms, and other extreme weather makes it particularly vulnerable to damaging climate risks. Concurrently, the continent's limited capacity for adaptation due to rampant state fragility, high rates of poverty, financial and technology constraints, as well as heavy reliance on rain-fed agriculture make it the least ready continent to cope with climate threats. Climate measures being implemented in richer countries around the world will also have far-reaching economic and political implications for African countries. If these international measures are driven by genuine partnership and shared aspirations with Africa, they could bootstrap the continent's adaptive capacity and support its battle to avoid the worst of the looming climate consequences. As Africa's largest trading partner, Europe's emerging path towards a net zero carbon future is outlined in the European Green Deal, EGD. This is of particular importance to African countries because it represents significant risks as well as immense opportunity for the continent. To help unpack these challenges and opportunities, I'm joined by the following speakers. First, we have Ms. Leah Achampong. She's a Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer on Climate Finance at Eurodad. There's also Mr. Robert Muthami, Project Manager, but also an expert in climate change and a member of the COP delegation for 2021. Mr. Gabriel Guglietti, he's the President of CRESUD and the Head of International Development Office at the Banca Etica. We also have Mr. George Mabua, who's going to be joining us from the Stockholm Environment Institute in Sweden. Fred Kuma is joining us from Kenya. He's the Vice President, Global Leadership Team, Africa Wildlife Foundation. And I have here in the studio Mr. Andreas Shida. He's a Member of Parliament with S&D, but he's also the co-chair of the Global Progressive Forum. I think I'll start with Mr. Andreas. Please tell the audience a bit about the European Green Deal. What is it about and how can it be relevant to Africa?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for organizing also this excellent panel today afternoon. I think it is touching a lot of important global questions. And when we look in our societies, in every state, we see that the impact on climate has a social negative distribution. It's usually those who create the negative impact and not those which have to suffer mostly. This is in our European society, so those which are driving the big SUV cars and having the cool house with the climate machine and the swimming pool in the garden and they can relax, are not they are creating more impact, but Let's say those which are suffering are those in the big housing complexes without any air conditioning and other facilities. So, and the same is true on the global scale. It is the industrialized countries, Europe, US, also upcoming China and Asia, are creating, of course, most of the pollution. But other parts of our continent, of our globe, is suffering. It's Africa, but it's also, for example, the Arctic region, just to take another one. And what we learned is, so therefore the European Union started to say, we have to take it serious. We have to reach this Paris Agreement. Yeah. We will have a clear plan, which is minus 55% of CO2 emissions and equivalents to it until 2030, so quite soon. It's only 8 years. And until 50, being climate neutral in the sense of not polluting more than also is coming with trees and other factors. And so it's not only a plan, we have to start also working on it. And to implement it is changing our societies, how we produce, how we eat, how we transport ourselves, how we live. But also it is in our global relations, trade relations, and other one, we have to look at it. And I think for me, it's important, when I say climate change, I mean it's not the normal people which have to pay the highest price for this adjustment. And it should also not be Africa. We learned it's close to 20 million people who are affected negatively by climate-relevant weather conditions, a missing of food and other things. So there is an impact, and we have to take it serious. And if we cooperate, then I think we can also manage it. And probably today we will hear some points how we can do it.
Yeah, absolutely. You make some very excellent points, Mr. Shida, especially about the social negative distribution and how, if we're not careful, climate change will worsen inequality because, you know, you'd have a lot of social injustice that emerges from the impacts of it. And I'm happy that there are people who are actually thinking in that direction and thinking of how we can have what I would love to call climate justice. I would like to reach out to George, who's joining us online, which is the next question for George Mabua. And the question is about scaling commercial applications of breakthrough green technologies. We see that the European Green Deal will definitely have an impact in scaling these applications of breakthrough green technology innovations, especially in Europe. But Africa needs to be part of this value chain. But unfortunately, it doesn't look guaranteed at the moment. So, George, can you please help us know how we can, as Africa, how we can take advantage of these opportunities, how we can participate, not just as consumers in this technology value chains, but also introduce our own homegrown African innovation and maximize on the opportunities, George?
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for this question. I believe the starting point is to engage. There are opportunities in Africa for Africans to take advantage of these technologies are quite enormous. And I think one missing link here is that there isn't that much of a catalog, database to identify these opportunities, as it were. So for me, I believe that one way to start this is to start engaging with potential investors and even at the level of the EU like this, to start talking about these issues between partners. And I think from that we can begin to have solutions that are mutually beneficial, especially for Africa. And if there are any learnings that can be made from Africans, by what Europe has done over the years, that could be a way to start taking up this technology. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for that very brief answer. Looking at how we catalog these opportunities and document them and engage actively as Africans in this emerging value chain. But, we would need some help obviously as African and entrepreneurs, African communities, African governments would require some financial assistance to be able to build their capacity to participate as equal partners in this value chain. And that's why I'm going to go to Leah to look at European climate finance. There is room for improvement in terms of funding for African countries compared to middle-income countries, Leah. What determines where EU climate finance goes, and how will the volume, the approach, and the terms of climate financing change towards Africa, especially with a potential EU-Africa Green Pact? Leah?
Well, thank you for having me on this panel today. It's good to be a part of these conversations that are taking place. I think one of the clearest asks from African countries has always been for there to be greater access to climate finance in order to carry out adaptation measures, but also increasingly to address the ongoing losses and damages that many climate vulnerable countries in Africa face. And this is something that we saw ahead of COP26 last year, where we saw African ministers call for 1.3 trillion in climate finance by 2030, and the existing global climate finance goal is 100 billion USD per year. So you can see that there's a significant need there, and that what's being provided doesn't match what the actual needs are. This week, I'm sure many of us have seen in the news that the awful, devastating impacts of the storms and cyclones that have hit Madagascar, Mozambique and Malawi. And that's reason enough to explain why climate finance is needed, especially when you take into account that the initial estimates from the International Energy Agency show that the impacts of COVID-19 will erase energy access gains made between 2013 and 2020. Which sub-Saharan Africa will be the worst hit region. And so these energy access gains, which should be able to support the achievement of several of the SDGs, including poverty eradication, education gains, better livelihoods, gender equality, all of these risks being erased. Yet for the whole of Africa, the annual average of climate finance provided, mobilized between 2016 and 2019, amounted to 26% of global climate finance goals flows, amounting to 18.5 billion USD. So clearly there's a need for climate finance to be urgently scaled up. A lot of EU-level climate finance is channeled through the European Investment Bank. And at COP26 last year, we saw that the EIB launched its first adaptation plan. This is a useful step to take. The EIB's work on adaptation will be driven by lending volume, and they have a target to increase adaptation finance to 15% of EIB climate finance by 2025, all of which amounts to a tripling of EIB adaptation finance compared to the previous 5 years. But the big thing is, why is this focus only coming now, after years of concerns raised by climate vulnerable countries on the lack of access to climate finance for adaptation measures? So whilst the tripling sounds good, the base that the EIB is tripling is clearly inadequate. And I also want to bring in the points around climate EU level climate and energy strategies. And diplomacy strategies, and in recent years the EU has highlighted that it wants to increase EU businesses' access within countries in the global south, including by having access to raw materials, including via export credit and foreign investment strategies. And it will be important to ensure that EIB business access in developing countries in the global south does not lead to the privatization of public services. Any investments made should be based on local expertise, knowledge and needs, and go towards counter-cyclical support for local communities. So new EU initiatives such as the EU Global Gateway and any sort of EU-Africa Green Pact must allow for African countries to have democratic country ownership of climate finance strategies, and prioritizing domestic policies design will also help to build trust and contribute to empowering domestic economies. I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to come back in on any further points.
Questions for you on this panel, but thank you for laying that out very succinctly about what Europe needs to do better about climate financing. I particularly like to note the need to do more with adaptation. I think African countries would require a significant scale-up of climate finance in support of adaptation more than mitigation at this point, because there are some places that have already experienced so much impact from climate change that adaptation is a huge priority for many of those places in Africa. I'm going to go to Gabrielle in Italy right now. And Gabrielle, climate change is hitting African farmers hard. Compliance with new agricultural standards as a condition for accessing European markets under the European Green Deal could constitute additional non-tariff barriers for African agricultural exports to the EU. Unlike their European counterparts, African farmers have little or no access to capital or subsidies. Are there financing opportunities to help improve African farmers' chances of meeting standards? How do we ensure that financial resources get to the communities where they're needed the most? I mean, most African farmers are smallholder farmers operating from the community. So I'd like to hear from you, Gabriel.
Pardon, je n'ai pas compris la dernière phrase. Si vous pouvez la répéter.
Okay, so I was asking about how we could improve access to financing for African farmers and get that to the community level where the help is needed the most, especially considering the fact that new standards for farm-to-fork policies in Europe would mean that there could be additional non-tariff barriers that these farmers have to meet if they will get access to European markets.
Merci pour la question, merci pour m'avoir invité. Je pense qu'il faut donner une réponse à partir d'un chiffre important, c'est-à-dire que l'agriculture en Afrique représente environ 18% du PIB. Je parle de l'Afrique subsaharienne. Mais seulement 1% des prêts bancaires accordés dans cette région sont destinés à l'agriculture. D'abord, on a ce type de réponse. C'est clair qu'il n'y a pas d'accès à la finance. Je peux dire, ça c'est un chiffre de la Banque mondiale. C'est le chiffre à propos de l'année 2020. Et le même chiffre qui a présenté la Banque mondiale dans cette année à propos de la PME était 100 milliards de différence entre la demande de prêts et la possibilité des banques de disbourser des prêts à faveur de la PME. Donc, avec ces chiffres, c'est clair qu'il y a une difficulté très forte pour développer une finance que peut rajouter le petit paysan. On n'a pas une solution, mais on peut dire que dans les dernières 30 années d'activité, autant que banque éthique, mais avec nos collègues d'autres banques sociales qui font des investissements en Afrique dans l'agriculture, surtout dans les producteurs, les coopératives des producteurs qui travaillent à travers le commerce équitable. On peut dire que l'accès au crédit a été possible. Il a été possible, je vous donne d'autres chiffres pour mieux comprendre, parce qu'aujourd'hui, la chiffre de crédit qui est disboursé par la Banque éthique, seulement la Banque éthique, à niveau de coopération internationale, pour la coopération internationale, pour le commerce équitable et pour l'inclusion financière, c'est de 150 millions d'euros. Ça veut dire qu'on va rajouter 2,5 millions de personnes, qui n'est pas grand-chose si on considère qu'en Afrique, on a plus qu'1 milliard de personnes qui habitent là-bas. Mais c'est pour démontrer qu'à travers des petits chiffres, avec les réseaux qui sont sur le terrain du commerce équitable, des paysans, des organisations sociaux d'investissement social en Afrique, je peux dire les collègues d'Alterfin, de la CEDI, de EcoCredit, de Cordaid, il y a plusieurs investisseurs sociaux au niveau européen, la Fondation Grameen Crédit Agricole. On peut dire qu'on rajoute plus ou moins 1 milliard d'euros dédiés à l'agriculture dans l'Afrique subsaharienne. Si on considère ces chiffres, on peut démontrer qu'il est possible de faire des financements. C'est difficile de rajouter tous les paysans, mais on démontre qu'il est possible. Donc, avec les nécessaires aides qui doivent venir par la Commission et le Parlement européen qui ont lancé les EIP, les programmes d'investissement en Europe, à travers une coordination très forte avec les autres EMF qui font ce type d'intervention, on peut rajouter beaucoup plus des personnes qu'on a fait dans le passé. On s'est organisé beaucoup dans les dernières 30 années, mais on peut faire mieux si on est tous coordonnés, même avec les réseaux qui sont basés dans l'Afrique subsaharienne et avec les autorités, bien sûr, parce qu'on ne peut pas faire ça tout seul. Mais on peut dire que l'investissement social qui vient de la côté de l'Europe, sociale, je dis, a démontré qu'il est possible de le faire. Merci.
Thank you, Gabriel, for that. I particularly would like to highlight the fact that, you know, over first of all, the 30 years of experience, impressive, lending money to farmers in Africa, but highlighting this important contribution that you made about working with local networks and just not doing everything directly. I think that's important, and it's important for a partnership between Europe and Africa to leverage existing structures and existing policies. And the challenge with climate action in Africa is not only a financing issue. You know, the policy challenges too as well. But on the 25th of March 2021, the European Parliament passed a resolution that proposes a potential green pact, which we've talked about earlier, between Europe and Africa. And there are policy implications if we're looking at this, bicontinental pact. And my next question is to Robert Mutami to help us examine what the policy challenges or the risks or even opportunities are for this kind of pact and how Africa can make the best out of that from a policy perspective. What are the policy considerations that we must be thinking about as policymakers across the continent? Robert.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this opportunity and also inviting me to this forum, which is actually very important. Let me start by unpacking that on the Africa's potential, and that links also to the policy paradigm. It's important to recognize that Africa has both the abundance in the natural renewable energy resources and the political will for transitioning actually to a more sustainable future, and that basically positioned the continent to become a hub for both climate resilience and also new green technologies, something that will actually benefit the entire globe. And looking at that from the perspective of creating new jobs, I think research is also showing that taking bold climate action could could be worth around 26 billion US dollars to a global economy, and that could create, like for example, 65 million new green jobs by the year 2030, and that also prevents many deaths and also climate crisis that affects most of the African communities. But as we address the climate crisis, I think the EU-Africa cooperation in responding to the climate crisis should be one that upholds social justice principles. And as both countries move fast in trying to address the climate crisis, then the most important thing for the African continent is actually the justice perspective. As we limit climate change implications for affected communities, it's important we look at how that also enhances social cohesion. Looking at, for example, the transitioning in various jobs. How do we create decent jobs in sectors that we transition as we adapt or respond to the climate crisis? The issue of gender considerations is very important, looking at where women are and how they are affected by climate change. But of much importance is also who benefits from green innovations, for example, in such kind of a deal. Does Africa has the potential to create those green innovations? If that cooperation, has the cooperation between Africa and the EU has to work, then I think it's important we also enhance the capacity for African countries to develop technologies on their own, because if we talk about importing technology, then the European Union will continue benefiting, and basically Africa that is much on the debt, it will have an implication on how it responds to that. But from the policy perspective, and also looking at where we are in terms of the policy issues around climate change, I think one of the most important thing between the EU and Africa is the aim at keeping the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal alive, and within the NDCs that the European Union countries have committed. I think it's important we maintain that path in limiting greenhouse gas emissions. But at the end of the day, it's also important we see then, as we transition from dirty energy to clean energy, how do we take care of jobs in that particular sector? From the African perspective, our NDCs basically have the conditional and the unconditional aspect, and much of what will happen in Africa in terms of implementation of the climate change strategies will depend on how the European Union and other developed countries will commit financial resources for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Looking at basically the COP that happened in Glasgow, and also moving to Egypt. And here I see an opportunity where the European Union could play a very critical role in terms of ensuring that we are at par with regards to the African position. One, the overarching goal, I think it's important we have an outcome that is fair and equitable. So the EU-African summit that is coming, we should work towards a deal in Egypt in the upcoming COP27 that speaks into a deal that is fair and equitable, and also assist Africa in trying to the recognition of the special needs and circumstances for Africa, looking at the research outputs that we have from IPCC, the World Meteorological Organization, based on the drought and also the flood crisis because of climate change and what is happening around that. The other aspect that we need to consider, I think most of the strategies that the European Union and even the funding within the Green Climate Fund and other financing resources is more focused towards mitigation. The key priority for Africa is adaptation. We're not saying that mitigation is not important, but adaptation being a priority, it's important that we put more resources into adaptation component. And the European Union could assist Africa more in trying to enhance financing for more adaptation projects, enhancing support for the global goal in adaptation in trying to make it sharper. I think in the previous COP26, we had a challenge from the African perspective in trying to get support from European countries, especially in prioritizing adaptation in Africa. And I think if the EU-African Summit could arm a deal that also supports more of adaptation efforts in Africa. I think that could align more within even the African climate change policy direction. Still, on loss and damage, I think it's not possible to avoid and reduce all losses and damages as a result to climate change. Underestimated economic cost for loss and damage so far, and by the year 2030, it will be around 290 to around 580 billion US dollars. That is a lot, and therefore, based on the deal in Glasgow, it will be important we see then how does the European Union provide more support within the framework that was agreed, and also facilitate or fast track the work that was agreed in the next 2 years, so that we move more towards support for loss and damage for the African continent. And I think once we have more support for adaptation, look at how we could enhance technology transfer for African countries, capacity building, and unpack the issue of loss and damage in providing the required support both for adaptation. That will be really important. I am not saying that Africa is still developing, although our emissions are at 4% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. That
I'd like to pause you there and go to someone else. I know you've got a lot to say, and we'll get back to you sometime in the panel, but I think it's time to move this conversation to another topic, because I've got Fred who's waiting to speak, and he's got something interesting to say, because, you know, Africa is not just sitting and waiting for help when it comes to climate change. Africa also has a lot to contribute to the world when it comes to helping fight climate change. One of the areas in biodiversity, especially in that sustainability of our planet, what it looks like, and the biodiversity that's in there. Africa is home to 8 of the world's 34 biodiversity hotspots, and the Congo Basin houses about 10% of all the world's biodiversity. But incidentally, and this is the complication there, is the climate change is affecting biodiversity, and response, energy, poverty, and Africa's coping strategy of dealing with the impacts of climate change also drives biodiversity loss. So, Fred, is there a Pan-African agenda for biodiversity preservation, and how can international partnerships help? You know, so for instance, we know or we've heard about the Natura Africa program by the EU, and that's just one of the many conservation programs that are international partnerships available to Africa. How can they help?
Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. I would like to say, as my colleagues, that can you hear me? I just want to check this.
I hear you very well.
Okay,
Fred.
Good. I would like to say that providing us a platform as Africans to share and talk about these issues is really important. I thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak. Africa actually, to our minds at AWF, is a solution to some of the challenges we face today, both on the climate side as well as on the biodiversity side. I think the two major crises for the world today is climate change and biodiversity loss. And the two together actually makes us exposed in terms of existential risk. The fact that we are here today doesn't mean that we'll be here tomorrow. But what does Africa actually offer us? Like you said, Africa holds about 10% of the biodiversity asset of the world. And significantly, Africa's biodiversity, especially forests, also acts as a carbon sink. Up to 0.66 tons of carbon sink occur in Africa consistently, which really helps reduce greenhouse emissions or manage that in significant ways. Biodiversity is a significant resource in terms of providing a global good in regulating weather, and the benefits that weather regulation offers is some sense of stability that leads to provision of basic services to people: water, even energy alongside our soils and stuff like that managed well when we have biodiversity in a stable way. But Africa's biodiversity isn't just there because shouldn't be taken for granted. I think an investment in Africa's biodiversity is critical. We talk a lot about adaptation and mitigation, we totally support that. But it's really important to invest in Africa's biodiversity because that's what we have. If we lose that biodiversity today, then we actually are losing the very basis of our existence going forward, both for Africa as well as the rest of the world. So an investment in Africa's biodiversity is really a number one thing that we need to look at. The other key thing that from a planning perspective that we need to look at is our model of economic development, which tends to take out a lot from nature but not give back to nature. So finding the balance globally is important, but Africa offers an opportunity here because Africa's development is somewhat behind the rest of the world. And so we can act as a model in terms of developing in a way that is consistent with ecological sustainability, but as well meets the needs of people. And at AWF, we've modeled what this could look like. So for instance, in our work in Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, that's within the Southern Growth Corridor of Tanzania, we've worked with communities around value chains of coffee, value chains related to rice, as well as value chains related to sugarcane. And what we've tried to do is to develop models that bring benefits to people, but allow for biodiversity to thrive, including connectivity of corridors where wildlife are in constant movement. It sounds small, but what is local can be taken globally. And what we do need and what we are beginning to have now is a vision for a world where development and conservation sit together. The European Union Green Deal is a very good example, and by extension, the Nature Africa agenda is a good one to hold on to. As leaders and governments position conservation alongside nature as a vision, conservation alongside development as a vision for development, it makes it more possible for local action to grow. My last point would be that the European Union and Europe as a whole needs to see Africa as a solution also for mitigation. Because look, Africa has some of the greatest reserves of water, of wind, as well as of solar energy. These three sources are key to green and clean energy sources. Today we are talking about green hydrogen as being a key source for Europe and as well as for the world. Africa can offer that. But for that to happen, we seriously need to invest on the continent, invest in capacity of our young people who are bright and capable. We need to invest in technology transfer, which is critical for us to move forward. And we need to invest in partnerships. Businesses in Africa and Europe need to come together. We've for too long seen Africa as the brother on the other side that comes with a begging bowl. That should end. We need to see Africa as a partner, a business partner, a development partner, and invest equitably across the board. And if and when this happens, we will see the prosperity of the two continents, in the subcontinent, Europe and Africa. And then we will find a solution to the global challenge of climate as well as the biodiversity loss issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred, for making that point that Africa does bring something to the table. We're not just coming empty-handed or cap in hand. So my next question is to Andreas. We're saying goodbye to the oil and gas era, aren't we? But have we learned any lessons from that era? How are we making sure that we are pursuing policy that avoids replicating the bad habits, the poor relationships, the technology dominance and dependency relations that we had in that era? How can we avoid all of that and have a far more, like Fred said, a far more mutually respective, a partnership that has far more mutual respect between Africa and Europe?
I think it's a very important, but also very complicated question at the end. But I think it is true if we simply say instead of gas and oil, we need another energy, and then we continue doing like we did, we would make a big mistake, because a lot of other implicated problems are also on the table. Like if we just drive electric cars instead of gas cars, we still have traffic jams, we still have the misuse of public space, and also there is a lot of energy and the resources put into the production. So we have to find in all these sectors new forms of transport, of production, and so on. And this, as you mentioned before, these EU-Africa Green Pact, which was proposed by the European Parliament as a potential. If we speak about this, then it is about also a new way of cooperation, and this counts for the energy as well as for everything. It is about ownership, it's about empowerment, it's about creating new opportunities and new jobs. It's about, when we speak about gas and oil goodbye, we have to speak about efficiency. We use so much energy for useless things. We have to speak about efficiency. We, as mentioned before, we have to speak about public ownership. Means also not only privatization and profit gearing, but also to say the sake is the supply of the people with energy and heating or whatever. So, and also when we speak about energy, there is a big, in the gas and oil issue, there is a big human rights issue. Yeah. If we speak about the Arabic country, if we speak about Russia, even if we speak about African oil producers, there is a lot of human rights issues. Yes. And when we speak about new energy, it must be also clean in the sense of must be also compatible with human rights.
Yes. Thank you for that very important point. You know, I hope I'm right if I summarize it, like that change needs to be deeper than just changing our sources of energy.
There must be real change.
There must be real change. So,
not the new check it.
So if we continue the same habits that we had when we were using oil and gas, obviously we are not changing anything. And that's important. And I think this is, a point to bring in Leah, because if we look at innovation policies, usually they ignore the fact that societies and economies are deeply gendered. And so if we're going to do something different this time around, what gender dimensions and local context do we need to be conscious of as Europe and Africa as we collectively pursue green innovation, and how do we incorporate these, Leah?
Thank you for the question. I agree that there needs to be systemic change within societies and our communities. I think a clear first step is about ensuring that women, particularly women from indigenous communities, but also members from the non-binary and non-gender conforming communities, are a part of discussions on policy development and policy implementation, as well as being a part of discussions on identifying solutions. And I would say that this also applies to any sort of informal discussions, including panel discussions. I note that the panel that I'm currently speaking on doesn't have any gender balance. I'm the only woman speaking on this panel. And whilst it's fantastic to have the voices of the African men on this panel, there needs to be space for us in Europe to hear the voices of women on the ground in Africa too. And additionally, understanding the intersectionality of gender inequality is essential and necessary to develop transformative policies that create deep-rooted, sustained and positive change. Without this, it will be harder to support women, girls, members of non-binary and non-gender conforming community who are impacted by climate change in different ways, but who are often the core implementers of community-based climate action. And this can be seen in when we come back to do discussions around adaptation as well. A lot of the adaptation measures that are implemented at a community level are done so by by women and by girls as well. And when we look at the figures, we can see that approximately 70 times more finance has gone to fossil fuels through G20 countries as international public finance institutions in a 1-year period than in the 20-year history of the Adaptation Fund. And so what we want to see is that that there is a shift in terms of the finance by carrying out gender analyses, which will help to determine what the differing needs and interests within society are, as well as help to determine what accessibility needs there are for different finance mechanisms, and to understand the power dynamics.
Thank you, Leah. And I was not disappointed. I was expecting you to chastise us for not having enough women on the panel, but I must apologize. It wasn't for lack of trying. I think we had some of the women who were confirmed for this panel cancel on us as late as this morning. So unfortunately, we have this a panel is nearly devoid of the gender voice, but we'll continue to try to improve that. And my next question goes to Gabrielle. And this is about the green bonds. The African green bonds market trails those of other regions. There's certainly more that could be done. What can the EU's public and private sector do better with respect to this? And how can that, what are the limiting factors, for instance? Are there things that we need to know that are like limiting factors for African countries to access or to participate in green bonds? What are they, and what can be done by either stakeholder to ensure that this process is far more easily accessible to African countries? Gabrielle?
Oui, merci. Je fais retour à la proposition du plan EIP, c'est-à-dire le European Investment Plan for Africa. Il y a considéré des garanties qui sont dédiées aux crédits qui sont dispersés par les banques, tous les banques qui sont engagées en Afrique. Je fais retour sur votre affirmation à propos qu'il faut faire ça toujours en réseau avec les organisations qui sont sur le terrain, parce qu'autrement, on va disperser, gaspiller l'argent. Mais, par exemple, on travaille qu'à travers les organisations de microfinance africaines, les réseaux Mine basés à Lomé, les réseaux Caritas Afrique toujours basés à Lomé. On travaille qu'avec eux, ensemble avec nos partenaires sociaux européens. Mais je voulais vous dire que c'est nécessaire de faire comme le gouvernement italien a prévu pour les obligations vertes et sociaux, une garantie de l'État pour soutenir l'activité d'investissement par les investisseurs locaux et internationaux. Mais il faut aussi, pas seulement garantir ça, il faut aussi contrôler que l'argent qui a été collecté par les banques qui vont faire ce type d'investissement soit réellement dédié aux entreprises vertes ou aux entreprises qui font du crédit au réseau du commerce équitable et des paysans ou comme ça. Si vous contrôlez sur notre site internet, on a déboursé plus que 2 milliards d'euros dans les dernières, disons, 5 années, pardon, dans l'entreprise sociale, dans le commerce équitable, dans la coopération internationale, mais chaque crédit a été publié sur le site internet avec son impact. Il faut être très clair parce qu'on a les normes universelles de gestion de la performance sociale et de la performance verte qui expriment clairement les investissements qui sont réellement dédiés et l'impact qu'ils ont dans la performance sociale et la performance verte. Il faut les contrôler. Autrement, ce sont, bon, vous l'avez déjà déclaré, ce sont des opérations de marché commerciales, mais qui ne sont pas opérations d'impact sur le changement climatique. Merci.
Thank you for pointing that out, that African countries need to organize and document and prepare a framework that allows for accountability for green bonds, especially throughout the disbursement and delivery, and also in terms of the outcomes and impacts, and that's important. And I think I needed to highlight that for people who are listening who might want to work in that direction. My next question will go to Robert, and we'll talk about critical raw materials, which demand of which would increase significantly over the next few years as a result of the European Green Deal, but also of the net zero commitments that other rich countries around the world have made. Africa holds significant reserves of this vital mineral and energy supplies needed for clean industries that will underpin all of these commitments from countries around the world. How do we manage the risk that rising demand from critical raw materials could accelerate environmental devastation and compound Africa's climate fragility? Robert?
Yeah, thanks a lot. One is that research is also showing that if we transition to green technologies, then there are more benefits than staying on the non-renewable energy sources or the raw materials that take us beyond the 2 degrees Celsius that we're talking about within the Paris Agreement. But of much importance is Africa's transition to the clean energy models or renewable energy technologies. The cost for that transition is quite high, and therefore it's important we look at then how do we cushion, for example, Africa as it transitions into green technologies or green or low carbon development pathways. And I think it will be important within that particular deal to at least arm a deal that helps Africa transition quite effectively, rather than going back into the non-renewable energy resources that it has in abundance. Because the biggest discussion, even within the just transition aspect, is the aspect of stranded assets in Africa. Who pays for the cost that is forgone for Africa not using its resources, for example, coal or other non-renewable energy resources? And I think within the African policy framework, there is that ambition or that potential for Africa to transition fully into renewable energy resources. Kenya, for example, is at 90% using renewable energy technologies, with an ambition of, by the year 2030, being 100% renewable energy reliant. And many African countries at that particular point. But of course, African countries will need to develop, of course, abandoning the resources that they have. But we need a deal that cushions Africa as they transition, taking care of the cost that is forgone, and that aligns with even the mitigation aspects within the NDCs, and that could be an important aspect or policy issue during the Africa EU summit, and therefore the mitigation aspect in Africa has to take that kind of aspect where we also look at the debt aspect within Africa, and that speaks into the social justice aspect, because Africa being affected by climate change, much of the resources, even the domestic resources within their own GDP is going to adaptation. And therefore, if we have to look at the mitigation aspect, we must provide resources that take care of the cost that is forgone for not using the resources that are available. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that response in terms of making sure that the costs of transition is not borne disproportionately. And I think this continues the conversation about social justice and ensuring that climate justice is also social justice in terms of transition. Now I've got to go to Fred because there's something that the point that Fred made, and I think also Andreas highlighted it in terms of making sure that we're centralizing human rights and that we are not implementing climate mitigation at the expense of human rights. So we're also not protecting or preserving biodiversity at the expense of indigenous community or indigenous people. And so, Fred, I'd put this to you because I think in Nigeria and also elsewhere around Africa, protection of the rights of indigenous people and inclusion of local communities is critical to sustainable biodiversity conservation. How can a potential Africa-Europe effort, which we hope will materialize very soon, avoid this long-standing problem of human rights abuses and land dispossession that's often associated with traditional conservation approaches? Fred.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start by saying that the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change indicates that by 2050 we need to have increased the forest cover collectively by 10 million square kilometers. That represents about the whole of Europe and a third of Africa. And so what happens as a knee-jerk reaction is to chase the target. And chasing the target means that we keep putting in place conservation measures that are not aligned to people. But the truth is that conservation is really about people. Without people, you can't make change happen. And so we need to focus on the role of people and the change agents within communities to make change happen. And once we do that, then our relationship changes altogether. It's not necessarily only about nature. It's actually more about people. Because when people are part of a conservation effort and benefit from the proceeds of conservation, then they are more likely and motivated to respond to conservation challenges. And if we can get that right, then we will be able to put things back on the pathway that is required. We do know that IPLCs, indigenous people and local communities, are small in number but manage the largest amounts of land, intact land. Many times they don't benefit from it, but our work tells us that these people are the biggest defenders, protectors and conservationists that we have. Our conservation bills across the board are so high. Governments are spending a lot of money supporting rangers with guns, and yet we have people right there who can be our champions. What more do we need than to create relationships with indigenous people and local communities and make them our champions? Then lastly, we need to look at the rules that govern conservation on the continent. To be honest, a number of organizations have made locations they're working in as though it belonged to them. They do not adhere to the laws of the land and take matters into their own hands in the name of conservation. That must stop. We all must respect the rules of the land and respect the rights of people, because these people are key to conservation. So guns do not answer the questions of conservation. What answers the questions are people. Putting people at the heart of conservation, ensuring that they are benefiting, and then that translates immediately to motivation. Motivation to protect, to conserve, because they are direct benefits. So that's what I would say to yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Centering people and making conservation efforts and climate action about people, not just about technology, not just about biodiversity. I like that. It's very humane approach to addressing this challenges. And I think it's something that we need to keep at the back of our minds, that this is really about people and about ensuring that we're all playing a role in this sustainable system. I'd like to go to Mary Ansel, who's a youth activist who's joining us from Nigeria, Mary Anso Pefere. And I'd just like a reaction to this. And obviously talk about, what your experience is as a youth activist in Nigeria, in Africa, talking about these issues. What are the challenges that you see? And how has this conversation contributed to your approach? What have you learned? And if there's anything that you want to add?
Hello, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Mary Anso, just to correct that.
Yes, please carry on. We can hear you.
Okay, so, excuse me, speaking from the point of view as an activist, I must say that the youth are making very huge strides. Excuse me, they're making very prominent and gaining huge strides with regards to climate action. Excuse me. However, I see that a lot of challenges hinder the participation of youth in Nigeria. Infrastructural challenges, insecurity. So I would say that, for this issue to be addressed holistically, the government would have to pay attention to some of these issues that hinder a lot of progress. We see that the COVID also came, and hindered a lot of things. So, but first and foremost, the issues of insecurity and then government policies as well, because as someone who also, excuse me, as someone who is into business as well, I do business, I see that, the ease of doing business, particularly in Nigeria, where I come from, is not so encouraging. So youths that have innovative ideas, are not supported financially. We have issues of insecurity, like I stated. We also have, basic, we don't have access to basic infrastructure like electricity, and the rest. So these are real issues that need to be tackled. Just like Mr. Frederick said, this the whole thing about climate action needs to be addressed holistically, from all angles, not just focusing on one sector like energy, and all that, but it needs to be addressed holistically. The government has to focus on poverty. The government has to focus on providing the enabling environment. We can see that the ease of doing things in Africa compared to Europe, is really different. And why is that? Because Europe has paid attention to creating the enabling environment for people. So as a youth, I would say, or I would encourage governments on both sides for Africa to pay attention, to the grassroots, pay attention to the needs of the youth, pay attention to focus on how youth can have easy access to finance, and then just generally improve the infrastructure. And then for Europe, someone talked about technology transfer, capacity building. That's very important. Education at the grassroots level, we need to focus on education. We see that most of these initiatives, are hampered by the level of literacy, for people at the grassroots level. So I would really encourage the government to focus on addressing these issues holistically. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for that. This is, obviously directed at governments in Africa, but also a bit of an expectation from the potential Europe-Africa Green Pact, looking at technology transfer and capacity building for young Africans to be able to participate in this potentially exciting value chain that will emerge from the pact. I'm going to turn to my trusty companion here. Mohammed, you were with me in the earlier panel, and I'm glad that you're back here. So I'd like to ask for your reaction as well and what your expectations are. First of all, react to the conversation we've had. and then talk about your expectations of Europe and Africa in this Green Pact.
Yes, I just want to tap on some of the stuff that's already kind of been said. I think, obviously, this at the moment is probably the best time to drive forward this conversation because the post-COVID-19 recovery, everyone's kind of starting afresh. So it gives us a chance to, start with a clean slate. And so I think that's quite key over here. I think another thing we need to recognise is that the AU and the EU approach is quite different. The EU goes in with major historical responsibility. They've had higher per capita emissions for many more decades compared to Africa. Africa has contributed very little to this crisis, but as we all know, it suffers major consequences as a result of all of this. And this brings me back to a point that Andreas just mentioned about, say, transport infrastructure. So if we're going to say, right, it's not enough to move from petrol or diesel-driven car to gas or electric or something. If you go, if you're in the EU, you can walk, you can cycle. You've got public transport infrastructure, so you can take the train quite comfortably. You can catch a bus. Go back to Africa, and a lot of these options are just not viable. Even something as simple as cycling, if you don't have decent roads and it's just been raining, you're not going to be able to cycle. So I think that, again, just shows, the major difference between what the situation on the ground in Africa is and the situation, our conversation in the EU is very different to the conversation that people in Africa have when it comes to transition. And I think that we can never forget that. That always needs to be at the forefront of our minds. Again, you mentioned something like the critical raw materials. Here in the EU, talking about electric cars, we are on another level of conversation. And I think, when we go back to Africa, we do need to understand the level of infrastructure there, and we need to make sure that the Northern Hemisphere, the EU, doesn't advance at the cost of Africa. So, the minerals and the raw materials that we are getting from there primarily should go and address, the needs of Africa. And again, I think this is why, the AU Agenda 2063 gives a strong focus on priority to poverty reduction, and the EU probably needs to focus and try to understand Africa's strategic objectives and interests more. And the AU probably has a role to define these strategic interests slightly more clearly and in a way that's, more socially inclusive for their people. So I think that's what I'd say on what we've already spoken about. One thing, I'm not sure if it's been touched on before I came, is the circular economy. So at the moment, the EU focus on the circular economy is quite internal. So they're more focused about how the circular economy will work within the EU. I think going forward, we need to make sure that rather than the EU focusing the circular economy on just within the EU, it needs to work with Africa as well. So at the moment, we export most of our electronics, for example. Most of the electronic waste from the EU ends up going to Africa. And I think, going forward, this is probably one thing that we really need to tackle, the circular economy, because without a circular economy, I don't really see a way forward how we can get greener.
Thanks, Mohammed. I think you make an important point about unintended consequences of very noble policies. So, for instance, the circular economy, but you have small businesses in Africa who are dependent on waste, electronic waste from what is termed as electronic waste from European countries. But these are gadgets or items that are actually refurbished and sold, some of them recycled and reused, and they contribute to a modest economy. And if you have a circular economy that ensures or makes sure that this waste is not showing up again for African, what happens to the small businesses? How does it affect them? And what do they do next?
I'm just going to draw a parallel over here. Whenever in London we have the conversation about the introduction of, low emission streets or something, the first question that comes up is, so what will the taxi drivers do? People will lose a source of income.
Yeah.
So there will always be a cost.
Yeah.
There will always be a cost, and I think we need to plan for that eventuality as we go forward. I think the best solution I could think of is, we need, as the circular economy, it's not something that's going to prop up overnight. It's not going to be immediate. We need to make sure we are retraining these people. So these small businesses that are currently dealing in electronic waste, as we've termed it, old gadgets that have come from Europe, maybe cars that have come from Japan, major market for Japanese second-hand cars. Most of them end up in Africa.
Yeah.
Second, third-hand cars. So all of these, if we are going to address this, we need to make sure that these people who are currently, their livelihoods depend on this trade, they need to have an alternative path. And if we're talking about something like critical raw materials, and if that industry is really going to get boosted, then rather than these people having their livelihoods dependent on electronic waste, we can bring these people into an alternative market and make sure that before we cut their livelihoods off, they have an alternative. So that alternative is key.
That's good to be thinking about the alternative. But there's always a temptation to externalize the cost of development. And sometimes that cost is externalized to the party with the least power in the value chain. And it's important that we continue, just like you said, we're very mindful of this as we increase our consumption of certain minerals. We're actually transitioning from consuming oil and gas to consuming something else. And we must be very careful as we externalize the cost of that consumption. But I have Leah who wants to join the conversation and make an intervention. So Leah, can you come on, please?
Hello. Yes, thank you. Through the conversation that the two of you have had, I've been thinking about the levels of investment and the levels of climate finance that are available and that are circulating within sub-Saharan Africa. So when you look at the figures, about 88% of climate finance in sub-Saharan Africa comes from public climate finance sources, which highlights the importance of public climate finance in large parts of Africa and the role of public institutions and governments, and thus the need for public climate finance to actually support public services and public goods and the flow of those services. But then when you look at data around spatial inequality between and within countries, it highlights that in a lot of cases, a lot of this public finance is going towards leveraging private finance within countries, and those private finance flows are largely going towards mitigation activities that are not providing services for public services or public flows of goods. In a lot of cases, those private finances are increasing national debt levels as well. So you can look at some of the cases of financing of gas infrastructure, which has been extremely detrimental to the local ecosystems, to the local environment, but also has increased energy costs within those countries, which has then impacted energy access gains that have been made, and because of the additional costs that the government is incurring within that country to repay any loans that have been given to them for that gas infrastructure project, the national debt level increases. So there's this sort of cycle of private finance and the impact that is having on some countries, and it's important to look at the role that these public economic institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, or whether it's a multilateral development finance institution, their role cannot be to continue to perpetuate cycles of high lending that incurs lots of fees. It needs to be thinking about providing grants and grants that support adaptation measures and that support the flow of public goods and services. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah, for adding that to the conversation. And I think Fred does have something to say as well. Fred, you have your hand up. You now have the room or the mic.
Thanks, Samara. So I just wanted to reflect on some of the conversation you're having. I also want to chip in terms of the role of resources. So the question that you posed, I think our colleague from Kenya, was about transition from where we are to where we want to go with respect to extractives and the extractive resources that are required. What I wanted to point out is actually that the value of resources that we have continentally is actually more important on the top of the land than underneath. We traditionally look underneath for oil and minerals and everything. But actually, what's more important is what's on top. Even from a climate change perspective, our trees are what keeps us living. Our rivers are what provides us what we drink. Our land is what provides us what we eat. And so it's really important for us to focus on what's on top. More importantly, because it's also renewable. And our value systems need to change around what's really more important. And this is a global thing, but also as well a continental thing. We need to start investing more in what's on top, because that's what's going to take us much further. Then to our friend in London, I also want to indicate that, look, economies are different. We can't try and develop as the Europeans or the US. They've developed, and I would dare say that they've developed in a bad way, because that's what has landed us in the mess we have today. We need to acknowledge that what we have is actually good. Our development is low in its footprint, carbon footprint, and that needs to be applauded. And so more investments need to come onto this continent to maintain that low footprint development, because that's what we need globally. What we have in the West is actually bad development. It doesn't deliver for us sustainably, and we need to really put that into perspective. And then lastly, our economic development paradigms need to change. The current paradigm is not working, it's broken. And we need to put nature at the heart of it and people benefiting from it. Those two things need to come together. And if they come together, they'll deliver for climate and they'll deliver for us collectively as well. So those are the comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you. What's on top of the ground is more important than what's under the ground. I think, this is a very strong perspective. You look at the paradigm that we have in Africa, where you see minerals under the ground and oil and gas and bauxite, and as those are the resources. Those are the resources that you fiscalize, and that's what's valuable. But what Fred is saying, I think I agree with him, is that the environment itself is an invaluable resource that we must cherish, and we must see as incredibly valuable, and we must, treat it with the same kind of, care as we do the resources under the ground. I can see Mohammed is nodding, but I would like to bring in Andreas here. I know we'll hear a lot more from Andreas because he's giving us the concluding remarks, but please respond to this conversation.
I think how Fred formulated it is extremely interesting viewpoint, and yes. It is astonishing because it's more looking on the surface than on what is underneath. Yeah. But I think he's perfectly right, because we spoke before also on this 10%, I think was the number, is even in the Sudan area of biodiversity. Yeah. So we speak about biodiversity, it is on the surface, it is in the trees, it is there. When we speak about food and water, we did not mention water today, so probably also a EU-Africa Green Pact must include something like water diplomacy in the sense of having fair distribution of water. Yeah. We need the surface. Yes. We cannot only dig in. So I think I think it's a perfect thing, because it is also what you asked me before on gas and diesel and so on. It is, we have to change our habit and our patterns. And as he said, we have to applaud Africa in the sense of having a less CO2 emissions per capita. This means also taking it as an example, and if we want to change the way how we see, not only to see, there are new resources which we can dig out, but to see also that there is something we have to protect on the surface.
On the surface, that's really, really good. I don't know if George is still there. George Mabwa, I'd like to have your thoughts before we have our concluding remarks.
Yes, I am right here. Thank you. So I wanted to make a point to support what Leah was saying. I mean, available data shows that climate finance flows have disproportionately been in the form of loans as against grants. And so this issue of building up these governments' stock of public debt that sometimes becomes difficult and puts them in an unsustainable path has to be re-looked at. So why are we giving more loans in the form of climate finance support for either adaptation or mitigation rather than, say, grants that would not necessarily overburden economies with very tight fiscal spaces to develop? So that discussion has to continue, and we must find a solution to that. Secondly, on the green bonds, this is something that I have been working on in my institute, the Stockholm Sustainable Finance Center and Stockholm School of Economics have been working together. There's a need for amplifying the capacity building that is required, especially by relevant stakeholders within Africa, because there's this, commitment by both the government and potential investors and others within the continent to find their own solutions, as it were. And of course, green bonds offers an opportunity to mobilize additional funding to support climate initiatives. But again, the problem of capacity, for me, provides also an opportunity for the EU to partner relevant institutions and Africans to really build capacity. We've done this over the years with the support of IFC and recently with the support of the Swedish Development Finance Institution, Swedfund, to build the capacity of bankers from Kenya and Ghana. And everybody, expressed that, this is an extremely important step to take because it's difficult if you don't really understand the technicalities in building a green bonds program, and which eventually should lead to successful issuance. But of course, there are other issues that must be addressed beside capacity. Issues of frameworks, developing guidelines that are consistent with, say, the green bonds principle, but also that takes into consideration the very unique contextual situations that help shape and deepen the green bonds market, which is still nascent in Africa, but has a lot of opportunities for the future. And I see this as an opportunity for the EU to partner Africans and begin to work on some of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for bringing up that point. I think this is a follow-up point to what Gabriel said earlier about absorptive capacity for green bonds. And I think that this is something that we should incorporate into a potential EU-Africa pact to look at how we could receive assistance in Africa to build capacity to absorb some of these green bonds that are necessary and important for climate action in the continent. I'm afraid we're coming to the conclusion of this very interesting conversation. I can see that nobody wants this to end, including myself. I would love to continue having this conversation, but unfortunately we're running out of time. And this is where I would invite Mr. Andreas Shida. He is a member of parliament for the S&D, Socialists and Democrats, the Progressives. He's also co-chair of the Global Progressive Forum, so he's a very progressive man. So I'll invite him to deliver concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I put a full page of only words, and I'm now thinking, where should I start with? Was a very rich session today with a lot of points which has to be taken serious in our future work. And I think this is the most important thing. Sitting here as a member of the European Parliament, it is not just doing an Africa Week. It is what we want is a dialogue to get the ideas how we should shape our globe in the future more right. That's why also we have the Global Progressive Forum. And the climate issue is one of the very, very serious one for all of our life, and including what the European understand as life standard. But if we speak about this, it must also be clear there must be life standard for everyone on the world. So what was mentioned today is about creating new opportunities, creating new jobs and welfare in Africa. But this is also about education, but it's also about the cost of transition and the cost of new technologies. And then we come to the point which was discussed at the end also, loans or grants. Loans are sometimes very problematic. Grants are very often much better. We touched the issue of human rights, especially in energy fields. We spoke about energy efficiency. We spoke about public services and also the bad impact of too much privatization in these fields. We spoke about biodiversity, which I think is extremely important. And Leah also criticized us rightly that the gender balance was out of balance. And so therefore, if we speak about any issue, including the climate and including Africa, of course, the gender approach in participation and generally must be also respected. So therefore, I think there is a lot of lesson learned. I just touched some with spotlights, but I think we learned very much, and it was a very fruitful debate.
Thank you for that summary. I don't think I'd have done a better job. But I would like to thank everyone who have made time to participate in this conversation from all around the world, from Sweden, from Nigeria, from Kenya, for making this conversation very, very exciting. Please stay tuned, everyone. The Africa Week continues, and we would love to have you with us online as you join, and please make comments, participate, share the link, get your friends to watch. This is an interesting conversation. The final event for today will be the Cultural Night, featuring a performance of a play, Nina Lisa, at the Théâtre La Maison qui Chantait. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Don't ask me, I hate French.
Anyway, that performance will be at 7 p.m. GMT +1. It will be for 2 hours. And don't forget, we still continue tomorrow. We'll have the first conversation, will be a stimulating conversation on the impact of technology on economies in the digital era. We'll be looking at opportunities and challenges for Africa and Europe. And that session will start at 10:30 and end at 12 o'clock. In the meantime, please have a lovely evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us.